The future of consumer has to be individuals sharing in the upside of the networks in which they participate. The future of consumer, I know it's a bit discredited as a term, but is Web3. Naval, you've described it as this decentralized creator economy. I think of it as individuals participating and sharing in the upside of startup societies, communities that then build products that then have a wider reach and grow. But I don't think this idea of monetizing eyeballs or people trading their time for VCs marking up rounds is the future of consumer. It's got to be individuals getting some kind of upside and value for their contributions to the projects, networks, platforms that they help establish. What do you think?
This is not a transaction that you hear a lot about, but seems to me one of the most significant of the last 5 years in the consumer internet, if not the most significant. Take a good look at these data points. Correct. OnlyFans is worth 2 Yahoos today, 10 billion. One thing that I've pondered the last few years is how so many smart people in the industry missed this opportunity. I was in Match Group at the time when OnlyFans first launched, and we looked at it, we talked about it, and of course the quality of the content or the content nature was a little too aggressive for us. And I think that soured a lot of people, but that's not the real reason why so many people miss this opportunity, because I think people love money, and especially people love $10 billion companies. I think people missed on the OnlyFans opportunity because this was the first true audience monetization play. It was tip of the spear for this category. Everything up to the point of OnlyFans was about aggregating audience, bringing it together, talking about views and likes and reposts or rechits, retweets, whatever you want to call it. OnlyFans was the first company to come in and take a very, very clean and sharp perspective at saying, you have an audience and we're going to extract dollars out of that audience directly. And that dude, whoever he is, Radovinsky, what a coup. $1 million a day. And that's what happens when you see something before anyone else and have the cojones to get after it. I'm really not surprised there's an agency model behind many of these OnlyFans creators. There's so much money to be earned. And as we know, content frequency or these drops is the name of the game. They got to keep people engaged. So it makes sense. I've thought a little bit about what generative AI will do to this space. And I think for some creators, it will augment them with superpowers they could never imagine. Everything from voice to video to images and having it done very personalized. So that makes sense. But at some level, I think it could be very detrimental to many of the creators as well, because individuals may just opt for synthetic girlfriends altogether and forget about the real thing. But who knows? I don't know why this just came to me, but path for OnlyFans.
What's also interesting is that I keep seeing this funnel that OnlyFans creators have created, which is a great marketing funnel for themselves, where they come and they be 10% OnlyFans-ish and 90% whatever network they're on. So they'll tweet all these funny takes and 90% of times, and then they'll put 10% of the times they'll put something that will tell their followers or some people that, oh, I have an OnlyFans, and they have thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter. So I think the line between what people follow or are okay to follow publicly and what they are not okay to follow publicly is sort of blurring on social networks, especially for most of the Twitter accounts which are close to unknown or have 20 followers or 5 followers or 0 followers.
I wonder if what comes next with regard to a niche for this kind of interaction with another human being, which is simulated, is real life kind of choose your own adventure, human in the loop, intervening in your life in moments and playing parts of a larger sort of online, email, SMS. Maybe there's a all different elements but they cross over into meat space, and you have human in the loops intervening, because that seems like something that people will crave, and that you can't do with the AI alone. Something like, I don't know if anyone's read John Fowles' The Magus, or a modern version of this would be The Game with Sean Penn and Michael Douglas. What do you guys think about that?
The price of dopamine continues to crash. So there's a fun thought exercise called the Bliss machine, where if I put an electrode into your skull, into your brain directly, and stimulate it and can put you in infinite bliss forever, would you do it? Most people would say, no. I also want to have meaning. I want to have ambition. I want to have fulfillment. It's like, okay, well, what if I stimulate the electrode such that, and your brain such that now you have meaning and you have adventure and excitement and all the other things that you want. So eventually everything you want can be delivered directly electrochemically, whether through media, whether through devices, whether through drugs or what have you. And this is the modern dilemma, which is, how much of this stuff do you want? How much do you want cheap dopamine? Because the cost of dopamine, the price of dopamine is going to continue to go down and down and down until dopamine will be free. And then why would you ever leave your coffin?
Where OF has managed to succeed with the original niche, I haven't seen the same happening with the rest of the creatives, musicians, painters, and anybody else doing creative work, where they have their followers and they would like to really much do the same, to have some kind of consistent, maybe one channel to get most of their revenues and interaction with their fans. In the next sit, I will show you one example. Here's an example of a talented young artist who's digital savvy, and as you can see, this is from her Linktree. So there's tons of different places where you can consume her content and find her and contribute to her success by buying some of her digital products. But that's exactly what I mean. This is what it takes currently to earn your living as a freelance artist.
That's a very interesting framing. I'm not sure where this shift went so deep. I think it's a mixture of a bunch of things. The supply of dopamine, releasing things or releasing content or media is just so much higher now. And it's almost endless, right? So I don't necessarily need to be in a certain area to get dopamine. I can just get dopamine from US, from Canada, from UK, from wherever, and not necessarily from India. And I can let dopamine creating media, dopamine releasing media compete with each other for my attention, and I don't even have to do anything. I just have to scroll my finger up and down. And of course, OnlyFans is a different level altogether, but TikTok, Reels, they've sort of made us into people who would rather just lie down in a semi-comatose position and just keep scrolling. So that's what everything is competing against, unfortunately.
This is the reason why in business I find consumer startups, technologies, and products to be most interesting. Pretty much no one knows what will take off a priori, not even the users. Short videos, scrolling on phones, disappearing pictures. I think a large number of consumer products, if not most of them, at some point, almost all consumers said that they would never use something like that. I truly suspect a Bliss machine would appeal to large swaths of the human population, much more than people would like to think.
In Margaret Atwood's haunting book, Oryx and Crake, it depicts a future where bioscience has reached a point where they develop a drug called Bliss Plus, and it gives you a raging sex drive and makes you immune to all STDs, and you also get sterilized by it. And they don't advertise that last feature, so then they use that to reduce the population. On the flip side of it, imagine you had such control over your nervous system that you could give yourself pleasure on command. how much freedom would that give you, as now nobody could manipulate you with your desires. You already have everything you want right here, right now, inside of yourself.
I think the same way that stevia can never replace sugar, TikTok can never replace living in actual life. I know there's this narrative that Gen Z is continuously preoccupied by short-term pleasures that are super hyper engineered to grab their attention, which is, it's honestly largely true. I'm 20. A lot of my peers, I remember I went to get a haircut one time. This woman who was around my age, we were talking about screen time, and she had 16 hours a day on TikTok. I don't even know how that's possible. But she was just not getting any sleep and just on TikTok all the time. So a lot of people are like that. Actually, people I met. But on the other hand, I know a lot of people who are actively taking many measures to resist that kind of life. I think just because even if it gives you the same sort of feeling, it's an incredibly hard problem to completely duplicate the biological feeling of free adventure and boredom in the brain. Like, you might be able to just get a kind of blunt pleasure with just drugs or TikTok or whatever, but you won't get the deep, complex, fulfilled meaning that a textured life gives you.
Do you think that we will reach an existential crisis once we reach a very cheap cost of dopamine? Or do you think we're already living in that world and we're just adopting to different ways to find meaning? One reference point that I like to think about is our primitive ancestors and food. They spent a lot of their lives getting something to cover their heads, and also just anything sweet that gave them instant energy, like glucose. But a whole bag of sugar is now just a few bucks. And so for them, that was heaven. That was the only source of dopamine that they were looking for. And yet here we are, adjusted to that baseline, and we look for different forms of life, meaning in life. Do you think that in the future we'll always continue to find that, or we just haven't achieved all forms of quote-unquote cheap dopamine?
Thank you, CR. Thank you, Kiki. Ice cream so good. It was you, Max, Pap, amazing. Ice cream so good. Ice cream so good. Thank you, CR. Thank you, Mustard.
I actually think that with going further with this thought experiment, that people just want to have access to bliss. I don't know if they want to have bliss 24/7. So I think if in this thought experiment, that if somebody were able to have this for a few hours, I think that would actually satisfy most people's wants. I think that more people want more than just bliss, actually, but they want to have access to that. It's the non-accessibility of it that makes it so desirable.
In the cyberpunk anime, if you pay attention to the background and the street scenes, their equivalent of homeless drug addicts in the world are people who are addicted to VR porn. Wouldn't generative AI art disrupt this then? If these agencies are recruiting girls to take photos and videos, couldn't they just then generate AI photos and videos to have the content they need for OnlyFans?
As Naval said, the cost of dopamine continues to plummet, and at some point, a large swath of society, I do believe, will be trapped in this oblivion of bliss. But I am somewhat encouraged by the fact that I believe that there's a renaissance in understanding, largely amongst younger people, that cheap dopamine is not the way, that there is no texture, no richness, no satisfaction that comes from cheap dopamine in perpetuity. And so you're seeing a new subset of society become re-engaged with things that humans have done for hundreds of thousands of years, taking walks in nature, swims, ice baths, sunlight, laughing with friends, nourishing food, getting back to the basics. I think that part of understanding that's emerging in society is very positive.
It's interesting that the very sources of these cheap dopamine hits tend to deteriorate and destroy the mechanism that perceives and enjoys them. So if you eat a lot of cheap calories, you become obese. If you are chronically masturbating to porn, simulated sex, you lose the ability to engage in the richer real life interactions with the opposite sex in intimate ways, simply because you simply don't have the mechanism or the abilities to do it because you haven't learned them, and it is all learned, right? And the same thing with fitness. You become obese, it's almost impossible to become fit if you're constantly cramming cheap calories into your mouth. Similarly, I think, and this might be controversial, but the video games, the simulated achievements of video games, I do think at the margin, and perhaps increasingly so, deter people from even understanding what it takes to actually achieve in meat space. So it's almost like all of these Bliss machine, the Bliss machine would destroy the very people that its clients, and it would be like a parasitical thing where like cigarettes that gave people cancer and therefore they could no longer consume them. I'm sure there's some other examples, but I do think that where people are coming to understand, which Norgard alluded to or described rather, is that there's a richer source of dopamine. Going back to the way the ancestral environment developed our organism, over 10,000 generations, and even the 300 generations of agriculture. And it's only really, if you think about it, it's crazy. It's one generation, maybe 1.5 generations that has this access to cheap dopamine. And the result, man, look at the incidence of obesity in the population. It's incredible. And then look at the total fertility rate decline, also amazingly drastic over the last 30 years, how it's declined. Because if you can, satisfy those primitive dopamine desires with porn, you're less likely to go out and actually engage in real life interactions. I'm sure there's more examples of this. I'll think about some more and maybe drop them in here. But great conversation.
Hey, that's actually meditation. It's not quite on command, but that's meditation. That's just a technology problem. Why can't eventually some kind of simulated drug plus VR combo give you the deeply textured life or the same emotion or the same feeling? I mean, obviously, now we're talking fairly far out technology, but something like Neuralink should be able to do that in theory. I think we're kind of already there, and the consequences are obvious. Porn addiction, screen addiction, fentanyl addictions. I think most Americans, for example, are on some kind of drug or alcohol or obsession or addiction. And just, it's a lot of modern success is being able to stay out of these addictions and keep them from consuming you, building shadow careers in video games, spending all your time watching TikTok or pornography and then doing drugs, smoking marijuana, which is now legal in many states, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a lot of modern success. But are we really adjusted? Don't we have an obesity problem? Yes, there are always people on the margin who can resist. And congratulations to you if you can. But for the majority, can they? Yes, that is where the thought experiment leads you. Eventually, people want more than just bliss. They want meaning. Eventually, they want surprise. This is the argument for the Matrix. This is also the argument for what Alan Watts used to say. Essentially, the Brahmanic God is someone who has access to everything, full consciousness. And so plays the game of hide and seek with itself because the one thing that it cannot have is surprise. This is indeed happening. In fact, many of them are buying up the rights for AI characters for these OnlyFans women, not just their current content, but the rights to produce all the synthetic content going forward. This is a good point. I do think it will, something like a Bliss machine, VR porn, etc., does result in reduced fertility. And so perhaps the people who are most addicted are the most likely to exit the gene pool. And therefore, there will be a strong selective pressure operating here, which doesn't always happen with modern goods.
Viewing these addictions as a precursor to a Darwinian fertility contest is a very interesting way of thinking about it.
This may be the answer to the Great Filter and the Fermi paradox, where the drive to be amongst the stars may be vanquished once you have access to a infinite on-demand bliss machine.
Thanks for bringing this up. I think this is a really important argument if we're actually going to talk about viable solutions, because the reality is that, yes, we have dopamine on demand, but I believe I'm one of these people who, about a year ago, I was engaging in pretty much all of the cheap dopamines that were available. But in the past year, I switched to a more primal and evolutionary lifestyle, eating nourishing foods, exercising, getting sunlight. And I can promise you that the feeling of being in the ancestral environment and being healthy is so much better than the cheap dopamine that it's not even a contest. I would never go back. I also think it's the wrong mindset to place the responsibility of the individual to use their willpower to resist these sources of dopamine, because it's just too gratifying and they will do it. And we've seen that in America. I think it's a more progressive approach to consider environment construction such that we can create a world that nurtures our best self without even considering it. So, for example, I'll write a little story, which is that in the standard American has easier access to the Walgreens and alcohol and McDonald's next to each other than they do a nourishing home-cooked food made by somebody in their community. But if you lived in Italy and you had to walk a mile to see your community and eat locally grown foods, they are living in an environment that nurtures these qualities that we want, but without thinking about it. And I think that we are building this world currently in response to this instant gratification consequences, and we can take this back and we can build the world to nurture our best selves.
Unfortunately, there's no institutional incentive to do that. If anything, it's the opposite, to give you more instant gratification. The only control you have is on the individual level to resist. Now, in the case of an infinite bliss machine, I'm pretty sure even the Italians would not be able to resist that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no institutional incentives to convince somebody to eat the cheap egg from the chicken in their backyard than to buy this health bar, which costs $3.99. And so that's a real problem. However, that's why I directly replied to Norgard's comment about the subset people who are becoming a little more educated and self-aware of the new world we live in and are realizing that the feeling of living a genuinely gratifying life just completely supersedes the instant gratification. And so we can just ignore the institutions as the individual and use the internet to educate each other about ways that we can do it and strategies we can enforce to build walls between us and these bad actors.
So getting back to the topic of this room, the future of consumer is bifurcated, it seems to me. You have the cheap dopamine and then you have the expensive hopium. So the ultimate cheap dopamine product is the Bliss machine. The ultimate expensive hopium product is the sovereign individual, sovereign both in society, as in that book, which everyone should read, but also in time and space. So immortal and interstellar. So the cheap dopamine products, they ignore the body, they hack the brain, and they minimize the carbon footprint because you're in the pod. You know, it's like an AI plus VR plus a sustenance sludge plus evacuation catheters, you know, the eye chair that becomes the Bliss machine. The expensive hopium products, they prioritize the entire meat bag of consciousness, not just the brain, not just where the dopamine receptors are, not just hitting those spots, but it emphasizes the meat's health and its rejuvenation and individual creativity and autonomy. And it burns up a lot of resources. It's expensive. And it does so to enhance like the sovereignty and optionality of the individual. So you got the, large language model teraflops and the Bitcoin miners cranking out decentralized systems, and they're all less efficient, but they're more free. It's expensive and it has a big carbon footprint. But the hope is we can transcend being chimps with smartphones and reach a step change and become immortal, interstellar, and more moral on a plane which we can't even imagine right now. So moral innovation as well. The cheap dopamine products, they're enjoyable, but they enslave, and there's no creativity of any sort. No new explanations, no babies, just lots of individual, hyperlocal, small carbon footprint brain bliss. And it's small carbon footprint because you can create stuff very easily that appears to be real, but it's not. And you can repurpose all of the different, AI girlfriends and change this or that. And, it doesn't cost anything. So it's very cheap dopamine, cheap bliss, very local, but it doesn't lead to anything new. And then the expensive hopium products are painful, but ultimately more enjoyable, which is a point Matt was making, because they expand our capabilities and what we can create, more and better explanations, more and better babies. So the Bliss machine, as Naval pointed out, and Norgard, is the dead end for our species. Maybe it's the jumping off point for a matrix-like super intelligent AGI, but for us, human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, it's pretty much the end. You die in the pod, no kids, you've had a great time, bye-bye.